Hello and welcome to Mothman's Bookshop. My name is Nicole, and today I'd like to tell you about Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson. Warning, I'll try and make this as spoiler-free as possible, but given it's a book review, there are bound to be a couple spoilers. I have thoughts about this book, many thoughts, and not necessarily good ones. I love a good mystery as much as the next person, but just because I haven't read many doesn't mean I can't recognize when they're bad. Truly Devious is the first installment in a 4-part series written by Maureen Johnson and published in 2018. The New York Times Book Review says, quote, "The Agatha Christie-like ecosystem pairs with lacerating contemporary wit, a multi-layered modern detective story," end quote. I don't agree. I think the book has quite a long way to go until it's anything Agatha Christie-like. Here's a trigger warning for murder and mentions of different ways to die within a poem. Look, a riddle, time for fun. Should we use a rope or gun? Knives are sharp and gleam so pretty, poison slow, which is a pity. Fire is festive, drowning slow, hanging's a ropey way to go. A broken head, a nasty fall, a car colliding with a wall. Bombs make a very jolly noise, such ways to punish naughty boys. What shall we use? We can't decide, just like you can't run or hide. Haha, truly devious. This poem would haunt Ellingham Academy for the next 80 years. This book is set near Burlington, Vermont, up in the mountains in an academy built by a business tycoon in the early 1930s. Its purpose was to serve as a completely free school for those especially talented in specific fields or those with some kind of specific affinities like reading or mystery solving. What's especially unique about it is the way it's kind of free range, and when the students aren't in their classes, they're allowed to use any utilities available and wander the grounds as they please. This, unfortunately, means this is a good place for tragedy to strike. When it first opened, our main villain and the namesake of the book, Truly Devious, struck the school, kidnapping Albert Ellingham's wife and daughter and killing one of the other students. This launches Mr. Ellingham, his butler, and a friend from the FBI into a frantic race to pay the ransom and get them back. This is revealed throughout the first half of the book in a series of flashbacks. While this is happening in the past, the present has new students arriving. We are introduced to Stevie, short for Stephanie Bell, David the coder, Janelle the engineer, Ellie the artist, Hayes the YouTube star, and a few others who will become important later on. Back to Stevie. Her thing is mystery solving, and she came to Ellingham with the sole purpose of solving the age-old cold case. But shocker, Truly Devious strikes once more, except we don't know it's them because there's one hint that supports that, and it is never mentioned again. The rest of the story is everyone grappling with the student's death, processing, reuniting, and connecting, while Stevie does all of this and tries to solve a mystery. Before I start, I want to give a little shout out to the dedication at the start of the book, because I think it's the best thing about it. It reads, quote, "To anyone who has ever dreamed of finding a body in a library," end quote. And I think it's A, hilariously morbid, and B, a lovely little homage to Agatha Christie's The Body in the Library, which I have yet to read. Now, let's begin. I fully understand that if a book is the first in a series, its purpose is to establish a setting, the main characters or villains, and the catalyst of the story. But the first half of this book describes everyone's arrival at school and meetings with counselors. As I mentioned previously, Stevie is like a young Sherlock. She's always making deductions and looking for mysteries to solve. At Ellingham Academy, aside from their regular schoolwork, everyone works on a project tied to their quote-unquote thing. Janelle spent the whole time working on some engineering project, David was coding something. Stevie chooses to solve the infamous Ellingham case. Even though this is pretty important to move the story, she isn't seen actually solving the case too often. Most of the exposition done in the flashbacks isn't too important to the main story, and it's basically its own complete tale. All of the mystery solving specifically for the Ellingham case is mostly done in the past by Robert Marsh and the butler. Whenever Stevie is working on it, she's either listening to a podcast about the case or described as being all sad and surrounded by papers on the floor, without actually working on anything. When I realized she wouldn't be doing too much solving on that end, I thought, okay, you know what, the author probably wants to focus the mystery on present day and the new murder. No! Wrong! Most of the solving is done in the last 100 pages and we don't officially find out who did it. At some point, while Stevie is getting ready for bed and going over some of the papers, a poem appears on her wall for a split second as if projected onto it from her window. It's in the same style as the original Truly Devious letter, and also looks like the letters are taken from different newspapers. I was so excited for it to contain clues to solve either the old or the new case, but I was so let down when it wasn't ever fully brought up again. If talked about in the context of the story, I honestly can't blame Stevie because it was only there for a second and she didn't have the chance to memorize it at all. So why would we get a new letter? I think because the author wanted to make a point that Truly Devious was back. Except the letter is useless and shouldn't be included in the story at all because Stevie doesn't remember anything about it and it's never brought back up. We see her try and fail to remember the letter, but it doesn't help her solve anything, and she never tells anyone about it, so what's the point of it being there at all? I don't want to exclusively talk about the negative here. I do think the writing itself is good and has potential. It's fairly descriptive, and while the flashbacks were carrying the whole novel, I wasn't really bored at any point. It was interesting to see how Stevie and the others adjusted to private school life, and seeing them interact in ways that actually made sense for teens was refreshing. I think a good example of this was when they first came to the school and Ellie invited everyone to her room to drink and play Truth or Dare. It was a really fun moment and you get to see how these characters interact in a realistic setting. Even her interactions with her parents were true to life, with Stevie cringing whenever they said as something that she didn't like, or when they made unrealistic or stereotypical expectations for her, such as her being a prom queen or a boy-crazy teenager. I think overall the characters are written pretty well and stay true to themselves throughout the story. I wasn't super surprised by any of their actions, even if they were drastic, because they were realistic and usually didn't just appear out of nowhere. What I don't agree with is the romance that's shoehorned into the story literally out of nowhere. People grieve in different ways, that I know. And while people grieve, they might make some questionable decisions. One of those decisions might be to make out with a schoolmate. Right after the murder, Stevie is spiraling in her room and David comes in to comfort and talk to her. That talking turns into Stevie and David making out. But I can understand that, since, like myself, they are teenagers and make impulsive decisions, and I can especially forgive the kiss because they're both grieving teenagers. But after they kiss, the author decides to turn it into a blooming romance. Stevie spends a few days being all awkward around David and questioning her feelings, but whenever the two interact, there's no chemistry, no playful banter. They both hate each other, and not in an enemies-to-lovers kind of way. The romance is forced into the story and doesn't do anything to progress it. Just because this is a YA novel doesn't mean there has to be a romantic subplot. Final thoughts? The writing and character design are pretty good, but the story lacks substance and shouldn't be poorly split into multiple books. Going into it, I think my expectations were a bit too high, but I think it's fair to be upset at a murder mystery that's 70% filler, 25% flashbacks, and 5% actual murder mystery. This is the first of a series, but I might only read the second book to find out who the killer is. Most platforms gave it a 4 out of 5, but I was disappointed and gave it a 2.5 out of 5. Our first question for this week comes from Foggy D, and he asks, do you enjoy long books, and where do you find the time? When I buy books, I don't usually look at the page count unless the book physically looks thick. Otherwise, I've been trying to make time in my day to read, because I've realized if I have time for my phone, I have time for a book. So far it's been working, and I also think that having a pretty loose school schedule helps. Most of my classes are online or asynchronous, so I do have quite a bit of time as long as I do all my work on time. The next question we've got also comes from Foggy D, asking, I see that the book is a whopping 448 pages long. Is there anything you would cut out of the book that wouldn't ruin the story? And to that my answer is yes. All of the romance. It doesn't belong in the story at all, and frankly the removal would make it better in my opinion. Thank you all for listening to the second episode of Mothman's Bookshop. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I can't wait to talk about next week's book because it is just so good and written so well. If you would like to ask a question, I've linked a form in the description, and if you want to know when a new episode comes out, do yourself a favor and follow the podcast. Once again, I'm your host Nicole, and I'll see you next week here in Mothman's Bookshop.